this is actually Freud's couch. And this is not in Vienna. This is actually outside of London. And I was there at a Freud museum, which was his old house. And so he had to flee the Nazis, and he left Vienna and moved to London, where he lived for the rest of his life. So you can go and visit Freud's house there. It's a very nice little house. It's modest. It's in a nice neighborhood. The landscaping is like spectacular, but they have his office preserved as it was when he was alive. And so this is the couch that he used, and you can see the chair behind it. So he would position himself in the chair, and then his patients would face away from him so they weren't distracted by him. You know, honestly, I'm not very sure. It's an interesting office, though. There's lots of masks and sculptures from all over the world. Okay, so when we talk about dreams, again, Freud calls dreams the royal road to the unconscious. And dreams have two types of content: the manifest content and the latent content. So what's the difference between those two? Well, the manifest content, if you know what a ship's manifest is, that's a pretty good way to remember it. What's a ship's manifest? Well, it's a list of everything that is included in a ship's cargo, people and otherwise. So it's actually what is there. That's the manifest content of a dream. Now, latent content is what the dream is actually about. It's the underlying hidden meaning of the dream. And obviously you would work with Freudian techniques or with a psychoanalyst to understand the underlying meanings of a dream. And typically Freud is going to say that most of the meanings of dreams are either sexual or aggressive in nature. When we talk about Freudian theory, a lot of this is kind of funny to me, because a lot of things have latent content or latent meaning. What is the hidden, unconscious meaning behind things? And Freud, for example, was famous for prodigious smoking of cigars. So much so that he had mouth cancer really bad. He had to have a number of surgeries, and I think ultimately that might have been the end of him. But he always had like a big cigar in his mouth. Without even going through Freudian theory, I think that we all probably have a good enough understanding of Freud to make some assumption as to the latent meaning of having a cigar. The story goes, I don't know if this is true, that somebody confronted him about this and said, you know, Dr. Freud, what is the latent meaning of this cigar? And his famous quote back was, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So I guess Freudian theory applies to everyone else except for Freud. Alright, this should look familiar to you because all of you have had Intro to Psychology by this point, and this is always covered in Intro, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. And if you're confused on this, look it up in the book. So, according to Freud, we have three parts of the mind. Alright, these are three underlying structures that give rise to parts of our personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id, or the it, it literally translates as the id, that's the primitive part of your brain, and that operates on the pleasure principle. So it's really seeking instant gratification. The ego, well, let's go to the superego next. And this is based on internalized social norms. And this works on the morality principle. So it takes a while to develop a superego. And then we have the structure in between that is just the regular ego. And that balances the id and the superego. And that works on the reality principle. So the ego does its job to balance these two structures. Here's a good little drawing from your textbook. fantasy ocean. And that's because a lot of the id is unconscious and you're not aware of those motives of the id. Now the superego here is represented as the church because that's where social norms come from. Institutions like that, or more likely your parents. And then the ego here is the town hall that tries to mediate between outside forces and the superego. I like this one better. Here's the id, the ego, and the superego, and little text bubbles of what they would say. The id, I want it now. Superego, you can't have it, it's not right. And the ego, I need to do a bit of planning to get it. Okay, so we have these little forces, and sometimes students immediately think of like cartoon examples or film examples of like the devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other shoulder, and the devil's saying, just do it now. And the angel says, you know, no, you can't do it, it's wrong. And then ourselves, we are the ego, and we have to balance those two forces. However, if one force becomes too powerful, you can see impacts in the personality of that individual. Okay, so we've got the id, ego, and superego. That's part one of Freud. Okay, so put that over here. The next part that we have to learn is the psychosexual stages. Now you probably remember this from intro too. And this is how the psyche develops. Okay? There's progression through these stages, and there's a force in these stages called libido. Alright? You probably heard libido outside of a psychology class. Similar, but a little different. This is desire or sexual energy. Now, when Freud introduced this theory, he's talking about little kids having libido or sexual energy, and people freaked out. Remember, this is a Victorian era, and people were really upset about this. But it's not like the sexual energy that an adult would have. It's just a force that drives you through these psychosexual stages. Now, what can happen is you can either transition smoothly and successfully through each stage, or, and this is important, you should probably write this down, you can either become fixated at a stage, so you become stuck at a stage, or you can regress, and there might be regression back to earlier psychosexual stages. So I think that all of you have probably heard of an oral fixation before, and that's Freud. Or if you see a little kid that's experienced some sort of trauma, and maybe the kid starts wetting the bed again or something like that, that would be an example of regression according to Freud. So fixation and regression, remember those two things. Now, as far as the stages, we have oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. We'll go through each one of those. Okay, so the oral stage here is from birth to a year and a half, and the theme here is that infants are driven to satisfy their drives of hunger and thirst. And how do you satisfy hunger and thirst? Well, through eating and drinking. And where do you do that? With your mouth. So think about this is essential for survival at this age. So you probably experience some sort of reward through eating and drinking. Now, I'm not sure if you've realized what kind of figure I have, but you know, some people might say that maybe I'm stuck or regressed to the oral stage. And I do this sometimes when I get stressed out or anxious. You know, I probably eat too much. So that would be a good example of this. Now, conflicts here. What the child has to do between birth and a year and a half is give up breastfeeding. And breastfeeding, theoretically, is quite pleasurable for the young child. And they have to give that up. So here,